Hello and welcome to this edition of Dr. K's Psychobabble, continuing our series Behavior Management by talking about how we write down and describe behavior. Now, describing behavior is one of the principal goals of the field of psychology in general. So our use of language and specificity in terms of identifying behavior is as important as all the other work that we do. Now, specific to behavior management, in many cases, we have to be very specific about the behaviors that we are trying to either create or eliminate so that both us and the individual that we're working with, including us, knows exactly what we're talking about. So if we're going to pinpoint a behavior, we want to make sure that we know when that behavior begins, when it ends, its characteristics, everything that we can to make sure that the target is right there. Now, there's a couple tricks or tests that we use in behavior management called the dead man test and the stranger test. So that's what this video is about, is how to use those tests to determine whether or not your particular description of the behavior meets the criteria for specificity and accuracy. So let's take a look at those tests. The first one, well, let's look at some behaviors. Sorry. Here's some pictures here of children at play. And I would say, let's look at the word acting out, the phrase acting out. I can say that each one of these kids is acting out. Now, the child that's up on the jungle gym may be acting out because I told him not to do that. In the upper right-hand side, I'm told these kids not to act out, and what I mean by that is fighting. And here's an individual that's not really behaving much at all, it seems, just seems to be sitting quietly at their desk, but that's been determined as acting out for that individual. Yet at the same time, these might not be behaviors that we're worried about at all. This might be a child playing actively on the jungle gym, the two kids wrestling, in a friendly match that's not a fight, and the individual that's sitting at the desk might be done their work and they're waiting for everybody else to complete and just contemplating the world. So these, when we look at individuals, each one of us can have different perceptions unless you have words and instructions to go along with them. So let's take again, now I'm going to have the right slide here. Let's take a look at these two tests. The first test is the dead man test here. Here's my dead man. Use that little icon for that. And then we have the stranger test, spooky character right there. And the dead man test and the stranger tests are tests that we apply. We apply both of them. We write out our behavior description, and then we ask ourselves, does it pass the dead man test, and does it pass the stranger test? And if it passes both of them, we probably have a pretty good description. So we're going to take a look first at the dead man test. Now, the dead man test simply says if a dead man can do it, it fails the test. So that's, you have to remember, if the dead man can do it, it fails the test. So behaviors, non-behaviors, the thou shalt nots, and unobservable behaviors all fail the dead man's test. And you kind of have to be a little humorous about the dead man test, because you have to think sitting quietly. That picture of the girl that was in the classroom, sitting quietly. Can you prop up a dead man, make them look like, and they'll sit quietly? Yeah, they can. And I say, don't fight. Dead men don't fight. So they're actually, in truth, meeting the criteria of that expectation. Don't be afraid. Dead men aren't afraid. So that doesn't meet the expectation. So each one of those things that thou shalt not, things you can't observe, like study for 1 hour, is really not a good behavior description unless you can document it after. You can say study for an hour and then complete this test that will reflect whether or not you actually really were studying during that hour, or were you just like staring blankly at the material and not doing anything, which a dead man can do. So our test for the dead man test help us to identify when our behavior descriptions are non-behaviors. It takes out all the thou shalt not. So all behavior descriptions that entail don't do this or don't do that or stop or any one of those fail this test. And the unobservable behaviors, the ones that you would need to actually test to whether or not, when we say think about this or contemplate, sit quietly, remember, any one of those things that we say, we can't really use those as behavior descriptions because we can't observe them directly. Now, if we applied that to here, could do each one of these things meet the stranger test? Meet the dead man's test. So here we're looking at, I say this kid is acting out. Can a dead man do these things? No. So that behavior description passes the dead man's test because the person's actively going around, so it passes that test. Now we haven't done the other test yet, so now let's take a look at this one. If I say don't act out, does this meet the dead man's test? A dead man cannot wrestle or fight or whatever this actually is, so that description actually passes the dead man's test. What about this one? And I think you all know that yes, we can prop up a dead man to look just like this. We don't even really know if she's alive. So therefore, it fails the dead man's test. So for that particular picture, using the descriptor, acting out fails the dead man's test. We would have to get more accurate and have a different way of measuring what she is actually doing. Okay, we move now to the stranger test. Now in the stranger test, we're going to use an example. Here's a woman, and here's her child running off to play for the day. And she says, no acting out today, Jimmy. Now she is using the word acting out because she has a mental representation of what that is, and hopefully Jimmy does too, but she has an internal she knows what she means, an internal representation of what acting out means. Now, let's say the stranger is the playground person or a teacher or anyone, and they're told, watch for Jimmy acting out, and they look at Jimmy, but they have possibly, unless it's been communicated what acting out is, they have their own thought about what acting out is. And the question, are these the same? Now, in order to avoid that situation, we know that acting out fails the stranger test because unless I've been told specifically what acting out means in a complex behavioral description, then I don't know what acting out is, and I might have a different idea of what it is. So that acting out word in the example that I just used fails the stranger test because a stranger may have a different definition of that. So let's apply that to these pictures again. So the stranger said acting out. Here's my stranger in a playground. That's a little odd. So the stranger's looking at this, and well, what is acting out? The child does not look like they're doing something necessarily wrong. It's very clear that this individual will assume that the child is not acting out unless they have that particular description. So this fails the stranger test. Over here, kind of the same thing. We call this acting out. Doesn't really jive with our definitions of acting out that we generally have. And again, here, is this acting out? No, fails the stranger test. So the stranger test fails across the board here. So let's look at some behavioral descriptions, really short ones that we use every day, and we'll see whether or not they pass the dead man test or the stranger test. So let's sit quietly. Now, sit quietly, we've kind of determined already that dead man can sit quietly, so it fails the dead man test. But sitting quietly is probably something strangers would agree on, and it does pass the stranger test. Doesn't matter. If you just fail one of these tests, it is not a good behavior description. You have to pass both of them in order for that description to be a good description of the behavior. What about exercise? Now, exercising is something the dead man can't do, so it does pass that. But what is exercise? A stranger might think that running is exercise, or this is why exercise plans really need to be detailed. It's not, I'm going to go to the gym and exercise. Not enough. I don't know what that is. Is it walking around the track, doing some weights? And usually when you work with an athletic trainer, they actually have a chart, and you actually go through the steps and you actually document very specifically what you mean by exercise. Eat sensibly. Again, dead men can't do that, so it passes the dead man test, but we probably all have different definitions of what we mean by eating sensibly. Listen in class. Now, unless we're actively asking them questions, testing after, this actually fails the dead man test, because we can prop up that little girl. We don't know. That little girl in the picture, she might be listening very intensely. This is sort of why, this is an aside, but in my own classes, I don't grade per se participation, because there are degrees of participation that are not observable. I may have someone in my class that doesn't say a word, but they are processing information deeply. Just they're introverted, or they're just, that's the way they work. They're busy doing notes, but they wouldn't be an active participant in class in an observable way, but they might be my most active student in class as they quietly think about the material. So we see that listening in class fails the dead man's test, passes the stranger test. Be polite. Well, sitting quiet and, being polite is almost a way of that's almost a don't do all things that are impolite, and it fails the stranger test. This may as well fail the dead man's test. And so, whether we're working a behavior for ourselves and we're identifying a change that we want to make, or whether we're working with another person, a family member, or whether we're applying this in a professional setting and managing the behavior of children or adults, it is incredibly important to look at that description of the behavior, that target behavior, and identify it using those two tests. Make sure that it's detailed enough and is an active description so that it passes the dead man test, and make sure it's accurate enough that anybody could walk into that and can look at that sheet and they'd be very clear what we mean by that behavior, so anybody could actually run the behavior. In fact, that's one of the reasons why in a professional setting this is so important. Because if you're going to have one behavior plan for a kid in a school, we want to make sure everybody knows what we mean about this particular behavior, so everybody can be a part of that behavior plan. So that's it for dead man test and stranger test. So go forth and write great objectives, great behavior plans using these two tests.